Welcome, everybody, to episode 6 of the Arch City Poker Podcast. My name is Tony, alongside Nick. And Nick, how is the day going for you, sir?
Going well. Hope everyone had a happy Thanksgiving. And I think in today's episode, we're going to be discussing some 3-bet stuff, 3-bet pots, 3-bet hands, trying to get you guys more comfortable with that aspect of your games.
Absolutely. For those of you who didn't follow last week, we covered the mental game of poker, some pretty important topics that everybody at all stakes experience, whether you're playing live online at a casino, a card room, you're playing at a home game. It's tough to be card dead. It's tough to have losing sessions. It's tough to have losing weeks, months, feeling like you never are flopping a pair. So if you're curious as how to navigate some of those spots and those feelings and emotions, and listen to some of the recommendations that we have at Arch City Poker as to how you can better be a better player, go ahead and check out episode 5. You can also head on over to archcitypoker.com, where we have tons of videos and content for both No Limit Texas Hold'em as well as Pot Limit Omaha that help everybody from brand new beginners trying to navigate from transitioning from Hold'em to PLO or vice versa, as well as those who are playing in maybe 5-10 and maybe even a little bit higher as to maybe how we can navigate some more complicated topics. And today we're going to be covering 3-bet pots, because if you're familiar with the Arch City Poker kind of strategy here, is we're quite aggressive, and we're going to be 3-betting probably a little more than you're comfortable with doing, and we're going to be doing it with hands that you probably will understand most of what makes sense, but we're going to add in some things that help diversify what your 3-betting range is, and we're going to explain why. And Nick, as we jump into the topic of 3-bets, we're going to start with, at Arch City Poker, why are we 3-betting often? And when we're deciding that we're going to 3-bet, kind of the basic pre-flop stuff, what types of hands are we considering doing that with, and why?
Yes, so why are we 3-betting in the first place? Like, why does it seem like good players are 3-betting more often than the rest of the live low stakes population, or at least if they're perceived good players? Why are more aggressive players doing that? Well, there's a variety of answers to that, but I think you can really boil it down to you are getting more value out of the top of your range. So you would want to 3-bet your premiums. I think you guys obviously know what those are, but you can also add in hands like some of the stronger suited broadways, like King Queen suited is one that you guys, I find you cold calling a lot. Ace 10 suited, Ace Queen suited, Ace Queen offsuit. I know I mentioned suited broadways and I said Ace Queen offsuit, but like, yeah, some of just like obviously the top end hands that aren't the obvious, like aces, queens, kings, Ace King suited, etc. The other reason is that, you know, we do want to have a little bit of deception or unpredictability to our game, so we add in some combos that are good as far as like blockers. Like you have Ace 5 suited, Ace 4 suited. You could also have some hands that have good playability, like some suited connectors like 10-9 suited or 6-5 suited. But, you know, what's the number one reason though? Like, why are we using a range like this? Like, why are we putting in more money against somebody's raise? Well, simply put, like, if you guys are playing at an 8 or 9-handed table the vast majority of the time, then, you know, if you guys are doing a lot of cold calling, you're playing a lot of multi-way pots. And so our equity share in the pot gets cut drastically once you start adding more players to the pot. You start also becoming more of a victim to the rake if you're playing at a casino and not like in a club or home game type of environment. So we really want to 3-bet to isolate players, and especially in the live low stakes games where we are mostly isolating recreational players, probably weaker players, fish, if you will. So yeah, Tony, the first thoughts I have when I'm sitting at a table, like if I'm looking for players to 3-bet, something I want to pay attention to is stack sizes. It doesn't make a ton of sense to start, you know, running like a lot of 3-bet bluffs against shorter or shallower stack players. 3-betting becomes more advantageous with deeper stacks and with position. A lot of you guys also will not 3-bet as much out of position, and we can get into in position, out of position maybe later in the episode here, but a lot of you guys get scared of 3-betting out of position because you're bloating a pot out of position. Well, Guys, you want to lower the stack to pot ratio. Generally speaking, from out of position, it makes your life a lot easier to take away your opponent's positional advantage. So it really comes down like trying to isolate a weaker player, trying to make sure that your equity share in the pot is as high as it can be. And when you end up heads up post flop compared to multi-way, you are going to have a lot easier of a time winning pots without having to have made a hand. Whereas if you guys are doing a lot of cold calling, you end up in a lot of 3, 4, 5-way pots post flop. You're really just relying on the strength of your hand and just the immediate equity that you have, and not your actual poker skills, so to speak. So, yeah, I think Tony, to isolate players, number one, and then obviously to get max value out of the top of your range, and then maybe get some added value out of some hands that they might do all right as cold calls, or maybe they're borderline folds, but they do a little bit better as part of your 3-betting range.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I know when I was first introduced to the idea of 3-betting, I mean, I think everybody knows you traditionally want to be 3-betting aces and kings, and for the most part, queens, but probably after queens, most people would probably say it gets a little fuzzier as to what hands you want to be 3-betting. I see a lot of people cold calling opens with ace king, maybe ace king suited. They might feel confident because they're like, well, this is about as good as it's going to get outside of aces. But some of the hands that we're going to be doing it with, I know for my game, some of the hands that I do it with are exactly what you're talking about, which is ace, king, aces, kings, queens. I'll do jacks, I mean, basically tens through aces. I'll, depending on who the villain is, and this is an adjustment that I had to make, which is, it took a bit of learning to kind of figure this out. But 3-betting isn't the same against everybody. If there's somebody,
Correct.
if there's somebody who's playing a lot of hands, I tend to 3-bet them more often with a wider range of hands because they're just not having strong enough hands. If the person hasn't played a hand in a couple orbits and they opened to $15 in the cutoff, I might not take 10 jack suited and turn it into a 3-bet against somebody that I think is pretty strong. But those are some of the adjustments that I made. And Nick, when you're thinking about doing 3-bets, and this is going to be a two-parter because I think this is important as well. We're going to get into bet sizing because I think that's important as well. But depending on the villain, are there circumstances where you're adjusting what hands you're 3-betting with? And then if you are, just kind of quickly, just so the audience can kind of understand kind of what realm of bet sizing we're working with, just kind of talk about like what sizings we try to make it in and out of position.
Sure. Yeah, those are great questions and starting points, if you will. So, as far as adjusting to type of opponent or what kind of hands, as a default, guys, in live low stakes poker, you should be 3-betting in what is known as a linear manner. So you have linear versus polar. Give you guys a really easy example. Polar would be you 3-bet pocket aces, but then you 3-bet a hand like king 6 suited. You would do this against somebody that you think is capable of actually folding to 3-bets quite a bit, or they're capable of actually 4-betting you, because what will end up happening is if you continue in the 3-bet pot, like if they call you, then you have top of range with your aces. But if you get somebody that can fold, you get value out of a hand like king 6 suited that doesn't have as much playability post flop. Well, guys, I'm just going to tell you right now, that's a much rarer scenario in live low stakes games. The linear side of the coin is what we're going to lean towards. And that's what you would lean on from out of position as a default. Typically, you would be GTO would dictate that you're polar in position and you're probably more linear out of position. What does linear mean? It means that essentially you have not only your pocket aces, but you also would have a hand like king jack suited or pocket nines. Like basically you have elite hands, like premium hands, but then you also have very good hands. So you get rid of like a lot of the bluffs, like the 9-7 suited, the king 6 suited. You still could have like your really solid blocker hands with the aces, like the ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited. But typically, if you look down and you think this is a very good poker hand, it probably fits in to your 3-bet or linear 3-bet strategy. So as a default, I would lean on the linear side of it, because what ends up happening is You do get some opponents that will fold, and that's okay if they're going to fold against your linear strategy. But a lot of players do not drive to poker rooms to fold. They want to see flops. And if they raise a hand, typically they're the kind of player that probably limps a fair amount of the time, but then they raise some of the time. And they're not raising hands that they don't want to continue with. So they want to continue against 3-bet. The nice thing for us is that typically you will only be 4-bet by pocket aces and maybe pocket kings. So your opponent will continue with pretty much a cap range, and you want to have, just like I said, premiums and very good hands against that kind of range when you do continue. So yeah, Tony, whether I am in position or out of position, I would definitely lean on a more linear strategy as a default. If I do find that somebody is routinely folding to 3-bets, though, then it might make more sense to actually have like either, I'll get into this with sizing, but like either a smaller 3-bet that's more inviting to get them involved with some of the hands that they're folding, or you just go more polar and you start adding just more bluffs. Like you can have ace-5 offsuit, king-6 suited, like hands that, like if you look down and you say this hand probably is a really bad hand to like just cold call with, but it's kind of borderline, like it's either fold, but like maybe I continue. That's usually like a good candidate for a 3-bet or a squeeze then, if you will. So to answer the second part of the question, sizing's pretty simple. I would say in position, excuse me, guys, we usually err on the side of like 3 to 3.5 times what our opponent raised. So like, let's say it's a 1-3 game and your opponent raises to $12. I think somewhere between $35 and $40 is a good starting point. Starting stack sizes will dictate a lot of this, though. If you guys are deeper, you could probably add a couple clicks, if you will. Like you can go to 4 to 4.5x if you guys are deeper. If you're shallower, you can then cut that back a little bit. So let's say we have a player that raises to $12 and they just have like $120 behind. And we look down, we have pocket aces. I don't think I would like the idea of making it 35 to 40 because I don't really want to fold them out of the hand, but it also becomes just more efficient to go like smaller because you leave a little bit more wiggle room post flop. Like you give yourselves a little bit more flexibility post flop. So I probably honestly, guys, against 12 would make it something between like 25 and 30, just like just a very small like min click. And that's if they're shallow. If they are kind of more standard, like between 100 and 150 big blinds, I think we can go 3 to 3.5x in position. If they are 200 big blinds or more, you can start to increase your sizing. Now, if you're out of position, I basically would just click it up from like 3 to 3.5x. I would move that up to maybe 3.5 to 4x. And again, use the same rules, the general rules, if you will, based on how shallow or deep your opponent is.
Yeah. I mean, I mimic a lot of what you said. The biggest, I'm trying to like add additional things from an outside perspective as well.
Right.
When I think about when I do 3-betting, because I'm pretty aggressive pre-flop. Most people try to sit to my left because it's just I kind of try to make people's lives a little hectic if they're opening a lot.
Yeah.
So essentially, when we talk about like pre-flop ranges, what we're going to be 3-betting, it's pretty fluid in the way that it. Besides the obvious stuff that we know we're going to be 3-betting, there's so much other stuff that I'll add into my 3-bet range as an adjustment to whoever it is that's opening. So It takes a lot of attention. You can't be on your phone. If you're really trying to like smash a table and you're really trying to make great decisions, you really need to be paying attention because you need to see who's opening, how often are they opening, what types of hands are they opening, are they calling a lot when they open, because people call 3-bets way too wide more often than not. They won't 4-bet unless they have aces or kings, and they'll just call. Like they'll call with 6s, they'll call with 8s, they'll call with 9s, they'll like any small pocket pair, they'll call with ace king, which is good for us because it makes it easier to navigate. I know when I start to add in a bunch of stuff to my 3-betting range against people, I try, and this is because I also have some room of development, but For now, I try to make it from in position is where I'm really expanding a lot of my additional opens. So if somebody who's been opening a lot opens middle position to 15 and I have 6-8 suited on the button, I'll probably make it 45. Just to kind of isolate them heads up, kind of make their life a little hectic. It's the same thing I would do with ace king, aces, kings, queens, all that stuff. But like Nick said, if they're going to be folding to 3-bets a lot, I will 3-bet smaller and more often. If they're calling a lot with my 3-bets, I will oftentimes try to trim out a lot of that weak stuff. At least this is what I do. I trim out a lot of that weak stuff, and if they're going to continue very often, I'm just going to 3-bet instead of like just cold calling with king, queen offsuit. I'm going to 3-bet with king, queen offsuit because they're going to call with queen, jack, and we're going to smash when we full flop a queen. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the approach that I take to it, and to kind of add like the way the bet sizings that I work. Like if I'm in position, it's 3x plus everybody who called. So if it's a $10 open and there's 2 callers, I'll go $30, 40, 50 because I'll add the 2 people who called and then I'll size it up. Out of position, I just go 4x plus everybody who called. It's just kind of like an easy way of doing mental math without, just kind of making it too complicated for myself because I'm a caveman. I'm a Neanderthal. I need crayons. I need I need a coloring
Don't
book.
we all?
It needs to be easy.
Yeah, and to add to that, Tony, so that's an important point that I want to make sure we cover very quickly. That Tony mentioned if there's like let's say somebody raises to 10 in a 1-3 game, and then all of a sudden you do have at least one caller, or there are multiple callers, which happens a lot in these games. Those are very advantageous spots for you guys to do what's. I know a lot of you will know this, but for you guys that don't know and you're more novice, it'll be known as a squeeze. So it's still a 3-bet, but it's known as like a squeeze play where you have potentially much more dead money in the pot. So that's a spot where I also will definitely widen my range up in position or out of position, because all the extra dead money in there is going to essentially add to your bottom line, like make the play more profitable. So I'm not saying like you guys need to go from like all of a sudden you're 3-betting like whatever, like king 2 or king deuce suited or 6-3 suited or whatever the case may be. But I'm just saying add kind of like a few combos for like each category of combo. Like let's say you're 3-betting in a linear sense and you're 3-betting like 9s or better. If you have a raiser and you have a few callers, I would start adding like maybe some 8s and 7s, or instead of maybe 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, I would start adding some more 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, because the potential to clean up all that money pre-flop it's massive. And so I just, Tony, I just want to make sure we add that in there, that squeezing, we definitely want to be wider than what we would normally be when 3-betting against just one solo raiser when it gets folded to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, just really understand who your villain is that you're 3-betting, because I've run into many times where I've made like my standard 3-bets to include stuff like 10 jack suited, which in theory is probably right. But as an exploit at these live low stakes games, we don't have to balance our 3-betting range against like nittier players. You just fold, you wait for something stronger, you just let them, we're not attacking strength, and we're not attacking players that won't continue unless they hit something, right? Which is your nittier, your kind of older clientele, so to speak. But kind of moving on. So we talked about 3-betting hands that we traditionally use, what we're trying to accomplish when we do it. We went through a whole series of pre-flop and flop stuff and how to interact with boards in position and out of position as the pre-flop aggressor. Because for the audience, just to make sure we're very clear on this, you will be the pre-flop aggressor in 3-bet pots. We don't do a lot of cold calling in 3-bets. At least we shouldn't be. And if you are, shame on you, because if you know that you're doing it, you're probably doing it too often, which is putting you in some pretty tough spots to navigate. So we're going to be the pre-flop aggressor. We're going to be the person 3-betting a lot. And if we're in position, do we treat that differently than out of position? We talked about the flop, and we talked about how if we're out of position, we're checking, and if we're in position, we're betting a lot, and we're talking about single raise pots in that context. In 3-bet pots, if we're in position or out of position, does that change at all between in position and out of position and maybe betting frequencies?
Yeah, I would say there are still similarities, but then there are like some kind of subtle differences that we'll talk about here. So, generally speaking, in single raise pots, I'm not gonna say when we're in doubt, but like our default strategy is to basically just bet smaller with range. Why do we do this? Because our opponents are going to play pretty face up against that kind of strategy. Like they don't understand that you're range betting, so they don't understand they need to attack that wider. So what ends up happening is and because your image is likely one of the more looser aggressive images at the table, they're going to play essentially more straightforward. Like they're going to fast play against the smaller range bet with top of range, and then they're going to call with everything that's like pretty good to marginal, and then they're just going to obviously fold the rest. So in single raise pots, that's definitely something we do because our opponents typically tend to be pretty capped or wider. When we get into 3-bet pots, we still will do that on most every like dynamic board. We talked about, if you guys don't know between dynamic and static, you can go back into earlier podcast episodes where we talk about that. I think especially on the flop episode. But basically, like if you're in doubt, you can bet range still in 3-bet pots. The thing is, keep in mind, the pot is going to be typically significantly larger than what it would have been in a single raise pot. So because there's not as much money left behind to play with, you need to kind of shrink your sizings a little bit. So like, let's say for example, you're somewhere around, we suggested like somewhere between 40, like somewhere around 40% pot when we bet in position with range in these single raise pots. But when you get into a 3-bet pot, you probably want to honestly be closer to like quarter pot to like third pot. And like I said, that's mainly because like the stack sizes are, they've become much shallower. Like we've just kind of bloated the pot essentially pre-flop with our 3-bet and their call. So the one difference though that I'll point out to you guys is that you got to understand what kind of range your opponent is now seeing the flop with. So with like a single raise pot, there are a little bit of differences between like just a cold caller and a limp caller, right? Like a limp caller is typically going to have like a pretty wide, weak range. A cold caller still could have a weak, wide range if you know that player, you know that they're just playing too many pots, but typically a cold call is going to be a little bit stronger. So you know that they can have a wide variety of hands. They're not going to really hit certain boards really hard for the most part. They're kind of going to be scattered all over the place. Whereas in 3-bet pots, if your opponents are typically raising just essentially what are known as good to very good hands, they're probably going to be pretty high card heavy. So, Tony, what I usually like when I'm going to a flop in a 3-bet pot, and let's say I'm in position, because we'll generally be in position more often than not in this scenario, anytime there are two broadways, at least two broadways on the flop, I think that's a scenario where even if it's a more dynamic board, but even if it's like Broadway heavy, so let's say it's like Queen Jack 7 with a flush draw, I typically won't just bet range in those spots because our opponent's range is so high card centric that they actually hit these high card boards pretty often, like very frequently. So it's not that we still can't bet. We still have an advantage over them because they didn't 4-bet essentially. But as far as like having a similar or having like who has like essentially the best hands on those kinds of boards in that spot, our opponents still can have almost just as many as we can. So we need to be a little bit careful about that. I still like the idea of betting because our opponent still plays very straightforward against that. But I wouldn't be so cavalier as to just betting air like we would in a single raise pot, guys. Like I would make sure that you at least have some kind of equity, whether it's like a gutter, whether you have like bottom pair that maybe it blocks some sets and you have like some 2 pairs or trips outs or something like that. Maybe you have 2 overs and you have a backdoor flush draw. Like make sure you at least have something, whereas compared to the single raise pot, we're betting complete air because we're betting our range against a wider range. But when your opponent's range narrows and it's very high card centric like that, those are the boards, Tony, that I would make sure that I'm a little bit more careful on, like maybe go a little bit more polar and meaning we bet kind of hands that are maybe top pair, top kicker or better, bet some like decent to good draws, or maybe some low equity draws like the gutters, like I said. And then you can check back everything in the middle and make it more of a 2-street game, because what will end up happening is, let's say you check back on that queen jack 7. And let's say, Tony, we decided we felt it was a good spot to 3-bet queen 10 suited. So we have top pair and we have like an all right kicker. Let's say we had the backdoor straight draw, obviously. But let's say we check back because we feel that our opponent just really, his range does very well on queen jack X. So we check back. If our opponent comes out and bets turn, and let's say he bets pretty large, we can navigate the pot pretty well from there. We can just call turn, and then we can evaluate river. And if he bets river really large, we probably know that they're under bluffing significantly in that spot, and we probably can make an exploitive fold. But let's say he now checks turn to you, and let's say it's a brick turn, just to keep things simple, guys. So let's say queen jack 7, flush draw 3, a non-flush completing 3 comes in on the turn, and now your opponent checks to you again. It's very unlikely that your opponent is checking a better hand than yours now. And so now you can confidently go with a 2-street plan and make it a 2-street game and try to get value over both streets. So I would definitely be careful on the Broadway heavy boards. But otherwise, like if it's just one Broadway card, or if it's a lighter texture, those are boards that, if they're more dynamic, again, we can continue with range, Tony, because our opponents won't hit those as hard. It'll be harder for them to defend against that strategy, and we can treat it a little bit more like a single raise pot scenario again.
Yeah, this is a really important topic. I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble navigating 3-bet pots. And I know for myself, because when I'm increasing my 3-betting range, I'm being forced to play boards that oftentimes do not connect at all with my hand. And I still have to navigate, because I still have, in theory, aces, kings. I have all the strong hands. So just because my frumpy 6-8 suited didn't hit on king, queen, 4, doesn't mean that we're out of the hand at all. It means we can still play our position aggressively. We can still play our hand range aggressively. You did it a few times. You brought up some indicators that you're looking for. I'm going to have us expand a little bit on that. So
Okay.
I'm going to try to ask these questions from the context of like what I think everybody's questions are. You have kings and an ace flops. You have jacks and a queen flops. You have tens and there's a king queen on the board. Or you have jacks and the board is extremely low, or maybe tens and the board is extremely low and you're not quite sure how strong your hand is. In single raise pots, you brought up a lot of examples as to how we can either bet or we can check to get clarity. Are there any strategies that you implement to help you get clarity in 3-bet pots so you can then decide perhaps when tens as an overpair, how strong of a candidate that is, or even though we have second pair, it still might be the best hand, but how do we figure that kind of stuff out when we think our opponent, for example, we have jacks and there's a king high board. Our opponent could have as many kings as we have. How do we figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why if you guys go back to when we have the previous podcast where we talk about flop strategy and we do talk about these dynamic and these static boards, like typically if you have an ace or king high board, unless there's like a lot of straight and flush possibilities, those boards tend to be more static in nature, just because the highest ranking card, the top pair in the top, or the top sets, the top 2 pairs, and the top pair, more importantly, types of hands will remain the best hands the majority of the time by the time you get to showdown. So our strategy overall on the static boards, for the most part, is we essentially tell you guys that you can bet top of range, and then you are pretty selective about the bluffs that you pick. So a lot of times with the kind of combos that Tony alluded to, when you, like, using again a practical example, let's say it is like king 8 deuce rainbow, like one of the most static boards in poker. And let's say you do have pocket jacks or you have pocket tens, and your opponent opened, you 3-bet, he called, and you have this king 8 deuce board. You know, that's a spot where we determine that jacks and tens are obviously not really top of range types of hands. and they have pretty good showdown value. So I would check back and then evaluate my opponent's turn action. If they bet small, your hand still can be best and you can call, and then evaluate river. And like I said, if they show strength in the form of a bet in a barrel in a 3-bet pot, typically that is going to be a little more value heavy and straightforward than it will be in a single raise pot. Remember these indicators, guys, or essentially this main indicator, that when the money becomes, let's use the term real, like when the money becomes, or the situation becomes a little more perilous in the eyes of a live low stakes player, that means like that the pot has become quite bloated, their stack is very potentially going to be threatened. They are typically going to clam up and play with their cards pretty face up. They're going to be quite value heavy. So if your opponent is showing a lot of strength, especially against your aggression post flop in a 3-bet pot, you better believe that they're probably near top of range. And so you don't need to bluff catch those spots to be profitable. You're not getting exploited or run over by somebody that's just attacking you when they know that you're wide or something with your 3-bet range, and now you're just betting and barreling post flop in this 3-bet pot. They just typically tend to have it. So yeah, Tony, I mean, the way I can put it to you guys the best without getting like overly complex in this podcast, if you determine that, like we've talked about this, where you have like basically 3 tiers or 3 buckets of hands, so to speak, if you're ever kind of questioning what the hell is going on in a hand, you have hands that are in the first tier that are going to be hands that you consider like your good to very good hands, like your value hands that can withstand a lot of pressure post flop. Jacks and 10s on a king 8 deuce board are going to be in that second bucket. Like you're going to have those kind of showdown bound hands, like hands that maybe you can bet for a street of value once you get further confirmation that your opponent probably doesn't have a better hand. That scenario would come where you check back that king 8 deuce board. Let's say it's a 7 on the turn, and especially if it brings in a flush draw and your opponent checks to you again, it's very likely that your jacks are the best hand. So you have 2 options. You can bet right then and there and then maybe plan to check back river, or you can check back turn, and that opens up the possibility for your opponent now to also stab with more of their air, or just value bet a hand that's worse than theirs, and you can just make it a 1-street game, and then you can call with your jack. So to me, it's about understanding where I'm at in my range, and if I'm kind of in the middle with a lot of those like second and third pair, like pocket pair hands, or if I did have like 8-7 suited on the king 8 deuce board, if I do have kind of a middling showdown bound type of hand, and I want to keep the pot small to medium, then I'm just looking to navigate the pot in a way that makes it like a 1 to 2 street game at most, maybe just a 1 street game with a lot of those hands, because there's already enough money in the pot. We're not looking to overplay our hand, and we're looking just to shrink the number of streets that are played. So I think, like I said, Tony, I think for these guys, like it's just a matter of having a good idea of where you're at in your range, and then using your opponent's information to then like adjust for where you're at in your range. Like if king 8 deuce, I check back flop. What I say, guys, like a 7 on the turn, he checks again. Let's say I decide, you know what, I'm going to check again because I have pretty good showdown value. I don't need a ton of protection with only 1 card to come, and my opponent is one that might stab river. Let's say the river comes a 3, pretty much a brick, and he checks for a 3rd time. This is now a mandatory value bet spot, and theory would dictate that because you checked twice already, that you can't have probably like very good hands in your range, that you would bet smaller there. You'd probably, like solver would tell you to bet like 40% pot. Guys, if your image is looser and aggressive and you're playing the way that we suggest to you, that is a beautiful spot to significantly increase your win rate compared to the average player. And let's say we bet pot, or we bet maybe more than pot in a spot if we think that our image is able to get us paid there. So like typically I wouldn't go more than pot because they probably don't have anything that wants to ever call that. But if your opponent thinks you're one that can bluff and you're more aggressive, and let's say there's $70 in the pot, I've bet 100 in that spot before, and I've gotten called by like ace high. So it's a matter of just using your opponent's information. If they check twice in a spot, or if they start to show more aggression, like they're going to let you know in a 3-bet pot quite quickly for the most part where exactly they're at in the hand. You do need to be a little bit more careful on like the really static boards because they do have the ability to slow play on those because they don't really fear runouts. But if you have any flush draw or especially on a dynamic board, guys, they're going to let you know exactly where they're at early in the hand. But just figure out where you're at in those three tiers. Like if you have a hand that's worthy of basically value betting over multiple streets, or you can bet and face a raise and easily continue, that's your tier one hand. But if you get some of those middling hands that Tony's talking about here where you're just kind of unsure, like we can switch it to real quick to like the light board where he talked about, let's say you get a 6-4-3 texture and you have pocket tens and your opponent checks you on a flop and you three bet him pre-flop and he called. Could he have jacks or queens? That's definitely possible. And I've seen some guys have kings in that spot in these live low stakes games. But they're going to have a lot of pocket pairs that are nines, eights, and sevens. They might have some overcards that they peel with as well. So you can get value out of those. You can still bet small with range in that spot. And if your opponent just calls, then there's a good chance that you're ahead of them. Let's say you think they might call with a hand like jacks or queens, and you're a little unsure on the turn. You don't want to bet here and overplay your hand. You can now check back and you can now make it a 2-street game, and then you can evaluate his river action. And a lot of times what will end up happening is they'll stab the river in that spot, and then you can bluff catch very profitably with your tens there. So just make sure that you guys are understanding where you're at within those three tiers. And that will change as the hand progresses. Like tens are really good on that flop for the most part, but it might not be a hand that you feel like you're going to bet all three streets with. Whereas if you had aces, you probably would bet flop and you probably would just continue turning river and end up probably coolering somebody with like a big pair. But yeah, Tony, I think, like I said, figure out those three tiers, guys, and pay attention to what your opponents are doing post flop, and their actions are going to tell you where you're at in your range or where they're at in their range, and that will help you adjust where you're at in your range with whatever combo you have.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot. That's some great information. Three bet pots are complicated. It's uncomfortable in a lot of circumstances because if you're playing 1-2 with a $200 buy-in and you're making it $30 or $40, I mean,
Yeah.
the SPRs drop so much already that you almost feel like your hands are tied as far as what wiggle room you have. And I know in my 3-bet game, I almost always downsize my flop bets just because it actually gives me clarity, right? Because they're going to raise with their stronger hands in a lot of circumstances. They're going to fold. They're going to feel indifferent. They're going to fold if ace king whiffed on a 10 jack 4 board or something. Or maybe they call it that specific hand, but overall, I would say it just gives me a little bit of clarity and I can kind of navigate the turn a little bit. But the other thing you mentioned, and this is what I personally do, I just make sure my hand has some value or some equity that can also come on the turn or the river. So backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. Maybe they are overcards where you have like the opportunity of binking an overcard. But if I'm just basically whiffed and I don't have any equity, I am more reluctant to c-bet, and I might just say, well, I do have king high here that has some showdown value a little bit, so we might just kind of check this one back. But for me personally, like I said, I just make sure I have some value that can bet, and I try to keep that sizing down a little bit. And if you're up against somebody who, again, it's very player specific, but if somebody's a calling station, you can size up with your made hands against somebody who's just not going to fold. And that's an exploit that we can take. And it's something I love to do, especially on ace high boards with ace king, ace queen against somebody who, cold called a 3-bet with ace 7 offsuit or ace 7 suited, whatever they're trying to do. And you can kind of identify who these players are because they're not just going to call your 3-bet and that's where you can figure it out. But they're calling everybody's $10 open, $15 open. They're just never folding. That's the type of player I'm talking about. And we have about time for one more question, Nick, and it's going to be in the context of when we 3-bet, more often than not, it's going to wind up being a heads-up pot. But luck isn't always on our side, and sometimes these things do go multi-way. And when that happens, what adjustments do we make in multi-way 3-bet pots?
Yeah, that's a good point. It will happen sometimes where you guys will end up in a 3, 4, even rarely a 5-way 3-bet pot. So It's not really all that different from what we suggest in the single raise pots. Basically, you want to be much more polar. I don't think, guys, honestly, we need a whole lot of balance in these spots. Like you would think to yourself I'll give you an example, guys. Like, let's say the board, let's use that Queen Jack 7 again, just to keep things kind of uniform here. So, like, Queen Jack 7 with a suit. Let's say you went for a squeeze and everybody called. So let's say 4 players see this flop. And you guys got to understand that obviously the more players that get involved here, the lower the SPR is going to be. So this SPR is probably going to get close to like ultra low, like 1 with a lot of these players potentially. You would want to be generally, again, this is in a very general sense, guys. Like, you probably just want to, your adjustment is going to be becoming more polarized. So like, you would, like, your threshold for what becomes a value bet needs to increase quite a bit. Like, the floor needs to increase. So like that Queen 10 that I talked about, maybe value betting like I talked about checking it back, but let's say like you have a really weak player and you are betting range in the spot, and you would bet that Queen 10 heads up as part of your range bet, obviously. But let's say you have 3 opponents in this hand. Betting Queen 10 is probably, like, if you get action, it's probably gonna be pretty problematic. And so like I would err on the side of maybe shading my or like moving my threshold to where like my worst value bet would be maybe with ace queen at that point. And then theory would dictate that your bluffs probably come from one of 2 things. Like, it's either essentially like your higher equity bluffs, so like it would be the flush, like some of the flush draws, or maybe like the straight draws, but then also blockers. And that's something that really gets, I think, honestly, a little too much into the weeds for this podcast, guys. I'm just going to tell you flat out that you do not need to bluff those spots. You basically just keep it pretty straightforward. Now, having said that, you will have situations where you can run with like a multi-way steal. Let's say you are in position and you went for the squeeze, and let's say on the Queen Jack 7 that you have like, I don't know, like 7-6 suited, and you flop third pair, and you decided that, yeah, it's like a decent blocker to sets, but like that's pretty rare. Like, we're just not going to bet here. It's just too likely on Queen Jack that at least one of these 3 has hit this board pretty hard, right? So let's say we check back, and then let's say we get a deuce on the turn. So now it's Queen Jack 7 deuce, and that deuce doesn't complete the flush draw. And let's say all 3 check to you again. I would probably, I mean, as long as the SPR is not like something to where we would play it over multiple streets here, like let's say the SPR is ultra low, I would probably shove in that spot, because even though you check back, it just, your opponents are weak and capped to the point where they don't have a queen or better. There's a really good chance they don't have ace jack as well, because that probably bets a lot of the time there once it gets checked through on the flop. So like, there are spots where, again, I told you guys, like, the 2 indicators for like reading opponents in the live low stakes games are the more money that's in a pot pre-flop, and then you go to the flop, the more straightforward they're going to act. And the more opponents that are in a pot, the more straightforward they're going to act. So 3-bet multi-way pots, even though they might seem, I don't know, like perilous again to you guys, like they're troublesome for you, they're actually some of the easiest pots to play in live low stakes games, because everybody's so damn straightforward. So, you don't have to, just because you're the pre-flop 3-better, like, you don't just need to bet that spot. Like, I would keep it to like ace queen or better. Maybe if you have like obviously some higher equity draws that are pushing some equity, like if you have like a combo draw, or like higher end flush draw or something like that, then I'm not saying you can't bet those, you can. But let's say you do check back and then they check you again, like, there's a clear indicator that your opponents like do not want to win this pot. Like, they have some kind of showdown value, or they just have air. And so let's attack them in that spot. Let's say that you guys are really deep, and it doesn't make sense to just like 4x shove the turn. I would bet turn there, and I almost would be rooting for my opponent to call, because I would think that they have like a jack at best. Maybe they have like pocket 9s, and they just think, okay, Nick's, he checked back flop, he's probably just stabbing here. Well, guess what, buddy? I'm going to bet turn, and then we're going to see if you can withstand the overbet river jam now that I'm going to put in after you call that turn bet. So if you guys, if you listen to this podcast, you watch the videos on this platform on YouTube here, if you more importantly come over to archcitypoker.com, we are going to show you guys basically in a paint by numbers manner how to get to the point where you feel comfortable doing what I just said to do, essentially. And that's being able to like run some multi-way steals in these 3-bet pots. Now, is this a scenario that's going to come up all the time? No, guys, the multi-way 3-bet pot is not, it's going to be a rarity, and it's going to be an even rarer situation that you come across a spot where you determine, yep, there's the green flag, I can go for this pot. The thing that you want to keep in mind, and I've had probably Tony ask me this when he was a student a long time ago, and I've had other players that I've worked with ask me this, and they said, well, they said, how do I deal with squeezing in these spots? Or let's say I am ending up at a really active table in a lot of multi-way 3-bet pots, but I keep whiffing. And then like somebody clearly shows strength and I have to keep folding. Guys, it's the same thing as these single raise pots where you get multi-way action, that your advantage comes in usually having either the stronger range or just having, it's an and or, like you have the stronger range and or you just have the stronger post flop skill set. So when you do hit something that your hand crushes their range, it's going to more than make up for all the times that you've whiffed in these multi-way spots. And that goes again for 3-bet pots as well. But you also are going to be the only one, more than likely, in these scenarios that's actually going to add a few steals to your win rate. And so these spots and all these chips and the dead money that you're going to collect, they're all going to significantly add up. But it goes back to the last episode we did with like the mental game of poker, where like just stay locked in. You're going to run into spots where you either run bad or you do whiff in a lot of these 3-bet pots. You're going to be heads up the majority of the time though, guys. And you're going to win your fair share of pots when you have nothing. And when you do have something, you're going to stack guys a lot. You're going to get more comfortable the more times that you put in these 3-bets. The more reps that you get, the more comfortable you will become. So, yeah, Tony, I think that pretty much answers the question. But yeah, I think with multi-way pots, you can err on the side of being a little more straightforward, err more value heavy. You don't probably need to be balanced, but gain more clarity, and don't be afraid to pounce when your opponents let you know that they don't want anything to do with the pot anymore. Like try to like fight for pots as much as you can in those spots.
Yeah, excellent points. And something that again we've said, I think, in a previous podcast, it's not if you whiff all these 3-bet pots and you're like, I have to fold a lot. It's not your job to win every pot. It's your job to make the best decision in the moment. And oftentimes that's going to be 3-betting and evaluating the flop. And maybe you have ace king on a 10 high board and you're like, well, I'm going to downsize here. We're going to bet. And all of a sudden they raise. Well, it's okay to fold, because they're not doing that often enough with air for calling with ace king to be profitable. And they're going to fold often enough to where that bet is going to be profitable. So it's not so much that we're concerned about binking all the things that we need to bink. It's did we 3-bet pre? What environment did we create for ourselves with the hand that we have? And what action does this hand want to take on this board? And if the answer is bet, then we bet. And if everybody's checking to you and they're trying to give you indicators that their hands are not strong, we just have to have the ability to pick up on that and take advantage, just like Nick said. But overall, yeah, Nick, I think that, 3-betting is a pretty complicated topic. You're going to go, my last point, you're going to go multi-way in probably deeper stacked games. Probably your 2-5s, your 5-10s, where people have 500 bigs or even higher for most of the table. Those will go multi-way pretty often. But even then, the play, you'd be surprised how straightforward the play still is, just because the pot's so big. People don't take leaps of faith with random junk very often when the boards, the pots are getting pretty big. But otherwise, everybody, I think this is a fantastic topic. And again, if you're seeing this on YouTube, if you're seeing this from a recommendation on X or our Discord, go ahead and throw us a comment. Let us know what you like. Let us know areas of improvement that we can have. And we'll try to create topics of conversation that are in the realm of things you want to hear and you want to listen to. Every single topic we bring up could be a 5-hour video, but we don't we don't have the time, and you don't have the time as the listener. So we want to pick topics and we want to hit actual things that everybody's experiencing at the tables, right? We know that when you're opening ace king, we're not always flopping an ace or a king. How do we navigate it though? What things are we looking for? So take those into account. And Nick, any last thoughts before we begin to wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, if you get 4-bet, only continue if you have aces. That's pretty much it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, everybody. Again, if you haven't already been to archcitypoker.com, go ahead and take a look. We have great content for both No Limit Texas Hold'em and Pot Limit Omaha. If you're seeing this on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. And again, if you're brand new and you're on archcitypoker.com already, welcome. And we're going to continue to upload content for your viewing pleasure. But otherwise, everybody, thank you so much and have a fantastic day.